name is Aaron Sandiford. I'm a political reporter at the Nebraska Examiner, and this is our podcast on Nebraska's 2024 Senate race, Picking Corn. We are coming to you today from the College of Journalism studios at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where your midlife host is pursuing a master's degree. Our guest today is Nebraska's newest senator, Pete Ricketts. Many of you know him as a two-term governor whose family started a little business called TD Ameritrade and owns the Chicago Cubs. Welcome, Senator. Thank you for joining us on campus today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
Absolutely. Now, how are you adjusting to the new job?
It's coming along good. Just learning the ropes, figuring out it's different. Obviously, I was in the executive branch as governor. Now I'm in the legislative branch, and the branches work differently. As governor, you're really running the operations of government. There's urgency about getting things done. In the legislative branch, it's a much slower pace from the standpoint. It's much more about hearings and letters and committee meetings and working on legislation. All those things take time, require, working with different people to kind of pull things together. So from that standpoint, the actual business of it works slower. And specifically in the U.S. Senate, that was designed to slow the process of legislation down. It's supposed to be the deliberative body. It was kind of known as being the tea saucer, so when the House got all frothy and boiled over in the cup, the Senate's supposed to catch it or whatever. Right. So it's by design supposed to work slower, though. The pace of things is just as fast as being governor.
That's what I was going to ask you.
It's like your days that fast.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you. This was the first political office you ran for back in 2006 when Ben Nelson was a United States Senator. Why did you want it then, and why do you want it now?
Well, I believe that this is what I'm supposed to do, that I'm supposed to take what I learned in the private sector and bring it to helping make government run better. And that's why I ran back in 2006 to be senator. That's why I ran to be governor. And really, that's what we did, is we took that business experience to run government more like a business, and we improved the level of services we provided. I could just go on in the different agencies and the numbers on how we improve stuff. And then now as senator, what I'm really working on is our proven net Nebraska solutions ready for America. So bring the things that we did well here in Nebraska while I was governor that we showed was effective, and now bring that to Washington, D.C. so we can bring that to D.C.
And what have you learned about the job that you didn't quite expect when you got to Washington?
Well, it's very much what I expected. I mean, I had a lot of, I'll tell you, okay. It's very much like, I worked with our legislature, so I saw how the legislative process worked, obviously not from inside it, but watching from the outside, but working closely with a lot of state senators. What the thing that I did not expect, or maybe I didn't think about enough, is just how broken the process is, how dysfunctional the process is. For example, we have not passed a budget. So what we are supposed to do is pass 12 appropriations bills in both the House and the Senate, goes to a conference, and then to the president's desk for signature.
Right.
That hasn't happened since Bill Clinton was president, 27 years ago. I did not expect, maybe I just hadn't been paying enough attention, but I did not expect it to be the process to be that broken, that we hadn't gone through a regular process like that in 27 years.
And for people who maybe don't understand, what's the value of that process for individual legislators to have some influence on?
Well, that's where, again, this is really important because, again, we're a big, diverse nation. You got a lot of different people coming to Washington, D.C., 435 people in Congress, 100 senators. We're all supposed to have a say in this. And by having 12 appropriations bills passed in a timely manner, you give, whether it's your senator or your congressional representative, the opportunity to offer amendments, to weigh in, to debate, to change minds or have their mind changed. That process is not happening in the U.S. Senate. We are not allowed very often to give amendments. And if we are, it's very limited. And frankly, my experience has been that Chuck Schumer, the majority leader for the Democrats, really only allows amendments when he believes they won't pass because he doesn't really want amendments on his bills.
Obviously, I've talked to a lot of new senators, a lot of new congressmen and women about the transition to this job. One of the things I hear most often is the steep learning curve for national security and foreign relations. You're on the Foreign Relations Committee. Can you talk a little bit about what you're learning that you did not expect and what's more complex than you thought?
Well, Aaron, that stuff's all classified. I can't tell you because then, we'd have to do what we'd have to do. Actually, I would say that one of the advantages I have, there's a lot of advantages being a governor and coming to the U.S. Senate. One of them is I worked a lot with trade missions. And so we had a lot of experience with foreign relations. It was really targeted around trade relationships, but that's a big part of our relationships with countries around the world. So I had a lot of experience that already. Also, I was kind of a history buff. So I generally kept up to date with what was going on in current affairs as well when it comes to things like national defense and so forth. So I think that I had some experience in that. Certainly, I've got a lot to learn as well. And I would say, actually, that's one of the other key differences, I would say, between being a governor at a state where you can really focus on the things you want to get done, and you have to focus, right? There's so much you can do. But if you're going to be in the executive branch, you really have to say, hey, these are the things I'm going to really drive. In the legislative branch, you have to get up to speed on just about everything. There's just a gabillion different topics that you're going to ask to get voted on. Now, you have a good staff that does the preparation and provides you the information and so forth.
Right.
But you have to know a lot about a lot of different things. It's a much broader context of things you have to know about versus being a governor.
But even within that broader context of the gazillion things you need to know, what are you prioritizing as a senator right now in your first and second years?
So the first thing I focused on, as I said, is about those Nebraska Solutions Ready for America. And that's the package of bills that we introduced that really came from what we did here in Nebraska, whether it's our tax cuts for veterans. We got rid of the state income taxes on veterans here in the state of Nebraska. I've introduced a bill to do the same thing at the federal level. Same thing with Social Security. We got rid of our taxes on Social Security when I was governor. I introduced a bill to do that in Washington, D.C. Flex fuels are a big deal for us. So I worked with Amy Klobuchar to introduce the Flex Fuel Fairness Act to help give flex fuel vehicles the same level playing field as other vehicles like electric cars and promote our biofuels. So that's a big thing. And then our SNAP Next Step Act, which was actually the first bill I introduced, was based upon what we did here in Nebraska to help families on SNAP, the food stamp program, to get better jobs and reduce or eliminate their need for SNAP. And I introduced the same thing in Washington, D.C. So those are the first four really big package of bills that I introduced based upon what we did here in Nebraska. I would say more broadly speaking, one of the things I really want to focus on is fixing the process to really get the appropriations process back to a point where senators have the opportunity to vote on 12 individual appropriations bills, to offer amendments, to have debates, to get them passed in time for the House to do their work and then give it to the president for his signature or her signature before we hit our September 30th fiscal year end. We've got to start doing our business on time. It's embarrassing that the greatest nation in the world can't get this job done.
What, you don't like governing by continuing resolution?
No, continuing resolutions are a horrible way to do business. Better than shutting down, but it's not a high bar, right? I mean, continuing resolutions are really, really bad for how we run government.
Understood. Now, obviously with Ukraine aid, it's been a sticking point with some folks in your party. And why is it that you support Ukraine aid? And what is it that the critics of that aid are missing? What do you wish they understood that maybe they're not hearing?
For me, it gets down to Vladimir Putin's a dictator. Dictators tend to follow the same pattern. They tell you what they're going to do, and they try to go do it. Putin said he wants to recreate the old Soviet Union, the old Russian Empire. He talks about Russians living outside of Russia. This is exactly what Hitler did. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf. He talked about getting Lebensraum in Russia and wanted to have that living space for Germans in another country. And then he tried to invade that country and take it. Hitler also talked about Germans living outside of Germany. Putin's doing the same thing. He is a dictator cut from the same cloth as Hitler. If he is successful in Ukraine, he will not stop there. And if he invades one of our NATO allies, like say the Baltic states or Poland, that's World War III. And so while it's very expensive to support Ukraine right now, and I get it, it's a lot less expensive than World War III. I had a mom come up to me at the state fair and she said, I don't want my 18-year-old fighting in Ukraine. I'm like, ma'am, that's why we're giving them weapons, because no Americans are dying in Ukraine right now. We want the Ukrainians to be successful. But if Russia invades the Baltic states, your 18-year-old will be fighting in Europe. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So that's why it's so important that we support Ukraine and make sure they're successful, because Putin will not stop there. He's a dictator. They're very consistent. Dictators are consistent in how they behave, and this is what he'll do. Now, the critics, at least in the Republican Party in the Senate, what they're concerned about is, hey, what about Taiwan? Because we also have to deter another dictator, Xi Jinping, from taking Taiwan by force. And so they're concerned about, are we providing the weapons to Ukraine that we may need for Taiwan? So it's not so much that the Republicans in the Senate don't want to support Ukraine. They're just concerned about our ability to be able to do Ukraine and potentially Taiwan down the road. So we do have to focus on deterring Xi Jinping from taking Taiwan by force. But at the end of the day, you don't get to pick your crises, right? They come upon you and you just have to manage them. And so we have to manage Ukraine. We have to manage what's going on in Israel. And then we have to manage what's going on with Xi Jinping and his aggressive behavior in the South China Sea.
And obviously you mentioned China and Taiwan. One of the things a lot of Americans don't talk enough about is the chip manufacturing that happens in Taiwan. They maybe don't understand that their cars and their refrigerators wouldn't operate anymore without some of the chips that are being made there. American manufacturing is trying to do some investing now to catch up. But when you're in these briefings, when you're in some of these discussions, what do Nebraskans need to know about how vital protecting Taiwan is to their economic interests?
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there, Aaron, with regard to chip manufacturing. I think it's something like 80% of all the high-end chips are manufactured in Taiwan, which means that, again, if we don't have those, we're not going to be able to produce a lot of the things from cars you talked about to be able to get done to cell phones. So that's one reason why we should be very interested in Taiwan. Also, about 30% of all the world's trade goes through the South China Sea. If the Chinese Communist Party cuts that off, that is going to drive up prices for consumers at a time when inflation is already sky high. I mean, we can see, that since Joe Biden's been president, inflation generally is up 17%. But if you look at like energy prices are up about 40%, right? Grocery prices are up over 20%. So if we were to see that trade get impacted in the South China Sea, those prices are just going to continue to skyrocket. So that's going to, in fact, impact every American family. And frankly, this is one of the things that I don't think Biden gets about Bidenomics. It's harming, middle and low income Americans more so than, upper income Americans. And, if your average American family is living paycheck to paycheck and they just lost 5% off of their buying power over the course of last year, well, one out of every $20 that you used to have, it doesn't even count for anything anymore. Well, that impacts your ability to buy gas, to pay your utility bills, to buy groceries. And that's why so many families are feeling the pinch of what's going on. And we see it, for example, I was just at the Open Door mission yesterday on how the demand for food has gone up. Food insecurity is skyrocketing. And you say, well, man, we got low unemployment. What's the deal? It's just inflation's so high, part of it, that food banks and places like Open Door Mission are spending 6 times the amount of money on food that they used to. And that's why all those families who never used to come to food banks are coming there now, because they're feeling the impacts of Bidenomics.
One of the things
that was a long way to get around. Sorry, Aaron, that was a long-winded, but that's kind of all ties together, like trade, prices, inflation, how it hurts families. It's all related.
One of the questions I get the most often from people when I'm out just talking to Nebraskans is, why don't prices go down as fast as they went up? I mean, energy prices are down now pretty significantly in the last month and a half, but food prices aren't trailing quite as quick. What are you telling folks when they're asking those questions about why it seems to go one direction and stick longer than the other?
Yeah, I mean, just because it's the nature of, even though one particular aspect, say cost of oil goes down, but that doesn't mean the cost of steel went down. Right? It doesn't mean the cost of all those other things went down. It just kind of depends. We still have supply chain disruptions. We still have a workforce shortage. I mean, if you want to look at one of the things that is also impacting inflation is the fact that we can't hire enough people. So, I mean, that's one of we haven't got more people. So
right.
That's maybe one factor that's going to continue to push prices up.
We got to get away from some of the international stuff, but obviously the war in Israel and Gaza is worth talking about. Tell me a little bit about the importance of finding a way for that aid to move forward.
Well, I think what's important to remember is that Hamas started a war. Wars are terrible. That's why you shouldn't start them. Not only did Hamas start a war, but they targeted civilians and committed atrocities, horrible atrocities. I've seen some of the videos that were taken from the GoPro cameras from the terrorists. It's horrifying. You cannot believe people would do this to other people. Just the things you've heard about, children being beheaded and a baby being put in an oven, and just the horrible things that Hamas did, they're on video. And it really is terrible what they did. So Israel has to defend itself. And I mean, it's a war. Now, if you go back and look what America did during World War II, we did the same sort of things. We went into urban areas to root out the Nazis. The Israelis have to do that to root out Hamas. And once they get that done, then you can start worrying about it. But I think to the extent that Israel can prosecute the war and take some breaks to allow supplies to get in, that needs to be at their discretion. But at the end of the day, they got to win this war. And once they win this war and get rid of Hamas, then they can establish a government that will look out for the good of the Palestinian people. You can bring peace and prosperity to the Palestinians in Gaza, but that can't happen. Just like it couldn't happen under the Nazis in Germany. You can't have that happen until you get rid of Hamas, just like we had to get rid of the Nazis in Germany.
And when you hear from the critics who will question why does it seem that our government values the lives of innocent Israelis more than the civilians in Gaza who really had no say in whether or not Hamas did what they did, what do you tell them?
There was a ceasefire October 6th. Hamas violated it. Hamas started a war. Wars are horrible. This is why you don't start wars. But Hamas is responsible for the Palestinians who have died in Gaza, not Israel. Hamas is responsible because they started a war. Wars are horrible. Don't start them. Again, go back and look at what we did in World War II, and you'll see we did, like when we were prosecuting the war in Germany, lots of civilians died because wars are horrible. But that's what you had to do to get rid of the Nazis then, and that's what you have to do now to get rid of Hamas.
You were governor for 8 years. What do you tell people are the areas where your administration made progress that maybe others before you had fallen short?
Well, we're talking about...
As governor, where did you make the most progress?
Well, we really improved the level of services providing people. And I'm going to talk about the SNAP program. This is our food stamp program. It was taking us in August of 2014, so before I came into office, 23 minutes to answer the phone in our economic assistance line. What does that say about how we feel about you as a customer if we're making you wait 23 minutes on the phone to get economic assistance? It was taking us 40 days to process SNAP applications. These are families that need food assistance, and we're taking 40 days to get back to them. So we set goals, answering the phone in 5 minutes, processing the applications in 10 days, so that we could work toward making that successful. And that's what we did. We really improved the level of service. And that I'm just using that one example, but all of our agencies, you can look at what we're doing in Department of Environment and Energy and how we cut our processing times for permits, like for air construction permits, down from 198 days to 65 days. That allowed companies to get in the field faster and hire people faster. All these things where we did a better job of providing services. That's also what I want to do in Washington, D.C. Bring those same ideas. Hey, we can do a better job of providing services at Washington, D.C. because I'll tell you, this Biden administration is completely incompetent. Like you look at the backlog on passports, for example, and how long it's taking to process that. Just one example of how they just are completely incompetent at actually running the basic machinery, the basic functions of government. That's what needs to change in Washington, D.C.
And when you talk about food aid in particular, obviously one of your sharpest critics has often, a lot of the nonprofits that help with the folks who are indigent have talked a lot about anger at you for not accepting the second round of food and rental aid. Talked about how it might create a welfare state in Nebraska, or a state of mind that leads to a welfare state. What do you mean?
So when we're talking about, look, people are rational. If you give them more benefits from the state than they can earn when they go get a job, they're going to make a rational decision and say, well, why should I work? What was one of the things we just talked about? We don't have enough people working. We need more people to take the jobs we have. And that's why we don't want to create additional incentives for people to stay home. That's what we're talking about. So, again, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, for example, was a pandemic-related assistance program. We took the first round, but the pandemic was over. Why would we take the second round? And what we want to do is make sure that we're not creating those incentives for people to stay home, but let them know that, hey, the emergency's over. There was good reasons why we did what we did. Maybe we didn't get everything right, but we had reasons for it. But now the pandemic's over, the emergency's over. It's time to get back to normal.
And now when you talk about running for a Senate race, obviously you spend quite a bit of time raising money. You ran the most expensive Senate race in Nebraska history up to that point in 2006. You helped your successor, Jim Pillen, and his top opponent, Charles Herbster. They combined.
I didn't help Herbster.
Well, yes, but they combined. Yeah, no, you didn't. But they combined to spend the most that had ever been spent on a governor's race in 2022. What do you think is the proper role for money in government and in politics? Well,
money is a form of free speech, right? And that's why it's protected. What you've seen through the court rulings is that the courts have protected the ability to be able to give to candidates or give to PACs or whatever you want to do, because it's part of free speech. It's part of how you get your message out, right? At the end of the day, you want to let people know where you stand on the issues, how you're different from your opponent. And they don't know that unless you take out a TV ad or an internet ad, right? You put it on social media somewhere, take out a radio ad, put it in the newspaper, whatever it is. You've got to leverage all those different channels to be able to reach your audience. And frankly, it's gotten more expensive because our media consumption is much more fractured than it used to be. I mean, you go back to like when I was a kid, there were 3 TV stations, right? And the Omaha World Herald covered the entire state of Nebraska. Well, neither one of those things are true anymore. So the media consumption market is much more fractured, and therefore it's a lot more expensive to be able to find ways to reach your target audience.
How fair is it that some can have that access, some candidates can afford that access, and some can't? I mean, what do you say to those folks who criticize that?
Well, again, you have to get your message out. There's other ways to do it. And if you, for example, are not going to be a self-funder, then you've got to go out and ask other people for that money to be able to do it. And you've got to convince them of your ideas. And maybe that means you got to start a little earlier to do it. But the fact of the matter is you've got to figure out how to overcome those challenges. And, if you look at, for example, my governor's race, we focused on going out there and talking to Nebraskans and actually raising money from Nebraskans to be able to run that race.
What limits, if any, should Congress consider on fundraising? And if not limits, what disclosure requirements should you guys be considering?
Well, I think that, again, in this day and age, we can get to the point where you can have instant disclosure. And I think that would be a good thing. Transparency is a good thing. You want to talk about limits? Let's go to term limits for House and Senate. There you go. You talk about that. Mm-hmm. That's where it should be. I think, again, Congress has to be very careful every time they're considering how they're going to limit free speech.
And obviously, you've heard this criticism both from the right and from the left of your time in politics. What do you say to the people who make the very direct criticism of you that maybe you and your family helped purchase both of your spots in politics? What do you tell them that they got wrong?
Well, I would say that, do you really think so little of our voting populace that's what you think that it can be bought off? Look, people voted for me because they thought I would do a good job. And I think we can demonstrate as governor, I did do a good job. Like, again, we talk about the level of services we provided. We could talk about the amount of tax relief we provided. If you go back and look at the things I said I would do, that's what I did as governor. And so majorities of the people in my elections voted for me to get me to be there. So not everybody's going to agree with you on everything you do. But if you were doing something that didn't resonate with people, you wouldn't get elected.
And the Republican Party nationally and in Nebraska has seen some changes in recent years, a shift that some have described as populism and many pinned to former President Donald Trump. What does being a Republican mean today? Well, first of all, let's talk about populism. That's not a new idea, especially in Nebraska. That's been around for a long time, right? William Jennings Bryan, don't crucify me on a cross of gold. Okay, so that ain't a new thing. Prairie populism, definitely not. Yeah.
So that's not something Donald Trump invented. But I do think what you see with populism then and now was a dissatisfaction with the way the elites in Washington are running the country. That's what you see. Now, when you're talking about what does it mean to be a Republican, well, I think the traditional Republican values still hold, right? We're strong on we want to have a country where we have a strong defense, because that's one of the most important things we do. We want to have fiscal responsibility. We want to balance our budget, because that's also important for a strong national defense, but also just the general prosperity of the country. We want to have government be the least intrusive it can be to allow people to decide. I mean, when you have Washington, D.C. coming up with a one-size-fit-all cookie-cutter type answer, you don't get good outcomes. Like New York and Nebraska, we're not the same. People there may want different things from people here. In fact, I would say that's pretty true. Right. That Nebraskans don't want necessarily what New Yorkers want. So you have to allow our system of federalism to work, and that can't happen if you've got a government in D.C. that's too big. So I think those are all things that Republicans believe in, and we want to continue to promote that. And we want to promote things like our values around, hey, the family's important. Right? That's the building block of society. And the things we do that undermine the family are going to undermine our society. So I think those things haven't changed. Now, there may be a populist streak in some of this stuff. And again, as Republicans, we have to have a big tent, and we're not all going to agree. But again, at the end of the day, this is why we have elections, to be able to figure out whether the elections are at the national level for president or whether they're for your county board. That's how we sort these things out. And where would you slot Pete Ricketts, the Republican, on that spectrum of where Republicans are today? Well, I think I represent a lot of what Republicans believe, that we want to have a strong national defense, that we want to have a strong economy, that we don't want the government interfering in our lives, that we believe the family is the building block of society. So I would say that, I would demonstrate the fact that I've won Republican primaries is that's probably what most Republicans believe. And you were obviously a top donor of the state GOP for a number of years and hadn't given it a little bit of while. There's been a leadership change, obviously. What's going on there? And do you think you'll be giving to that team again? Well, you got to go ask the Nebraska Republican Party what's going on there. So they've kind of had, as you pointed out, they had a change in leadership. They've gone a different direction. And, they're doing what they think they should be doing. And as far as what that is, you have to go ask them. What is it? What crosses your mind when you hear somebody call Pete Ricketts a rhino? Well, that's what Donald Trump said about me, right? Right. You know what? Look, people, like I said, we got a big, diverse party in the Republican Party. We're not all going to agree. And I don't think it's personally helpful. I like, the name calling like that. But at the end of the day, we do have a Constitution that protects that free speech.
What role does your personal faith play in your political and policy decision making?
Oh, it's very important. It's the foundation of the whole reason why I got involved. Like I said, I think I'm supposed to be doing this, that I was called to do this. God has a mission for all of us in life. Part of our job is to discern what that is and try to follow it to the best of our ability. And frankly, that's what's going to lead to the most happiness in life. I've been very blessed with this opportunity. I've absolutely loved the ability to be involved in politics. Even when I ran in my Senate race and lost badly. Ben Nelson really, handed my tail to me.
Yes.
You didn't have to say that, Darren. You didn't have to agree with me.
Sorry, I'm paid to tell the truth.
Yeah, well, you could just nod. They can't see it. Anyway, so
apologies.
So no, you don't apologize. So anyway, I love that race, even though I got killed in it. I love the process, and so it just feels like this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
And talk to me a little about how do you still represent, how do you live that faith and let it inform your decision making and your policies, and still represent people who maybe believe differently than you?
I think it's a couple things. First of all, this is why, again, you talked about getting your message out, or we talked about that. You want to tell people where you stand. So I remember after I first got elected governor, was talking to somebody and I said, you may not agree with what I've done, but you cannot be surprised what I did, because I told you during my election, the primary and general election campaign season, what I stood for and what I was going to do. So I think that's where you start. And I can tell you that even if somebody disagrees with you, if you said this is what I was going to do when you ran, they know that going in. They may not like it, but at least they respect the fact that you told them what you're going to do and you lived up to it. So I think that's where you start.
Okay. And right now, obviously, there's a big debate brewing among the public and in the legislature about school choice. You and your family have donated to private schools, including a Catholic school in East Omaha. What could and should be done at the federal level on school choice? Well,
broadly speaking, I think education is best left up to the states, because again, this gets back to the one-size-fit-all answer. If there's things we can do at the federal level, I think to encourage school choice, I'd be supportive of those things. But broadly speaking, really school choice should be something that gets handled at the state level, so you can tailor the solutions to what the people in those states want.
You have served as governor for 8 years and as a senator now for quite some time. Talk a little bit.
Not that long, Aaron. It's only 10 months.
But talk a little bit about what you're hearing from rural Nebraskans about what they need, and what can the federal government do to help?
Well, I would say and this is not just rural Nebraskans, but I think it does impact rural Nebraskans maybe more so than other people, inflation. Because when you add on not only the cost of groceries going up as much as they are, when you then add on just the distances that maybe people have to travel to get those groceries, and the cost of gas prices going up. I mean, gas prices are up outrageously. Mm-hmm. So when you see those things happening, it impacts rural Nebraskans more than maybe somebody in Omaha, because they don't have to drive as far. So they're not using as much gas to get those groceries. So I think that's one of the big keys there, is making sure we're doing that. And then there's a host of other things that we got to make sure that whenever we're doing policies, that we keep in mind our folks in rural areas, because it's not going to be the same solution. I remember I talked about like Nebraska and New York being different. Well, mm-hmm. Somebody in Arthur is going to have something different they probably want than people in Omaha, right? So we got to make sure that we're not doing policies that are all centered around just urban dwelling folks, that we're also thinking about rural folks. For example, I'll give you an example. The president has his tailpipe emissions. Mm-hmm. Okay. So he wants 2/3 of all cars by 2030 that are sold by 2030 to be electric vehicles. Well, electric vehicles work really well in urban areas like Washington, D.C., and even in Omaha. And by the way, I'm not against electric vehicles. They're cool. I mean, they go fast, right? They accelerate faster than regular cars.
They do have some get up and go.
They got some get up and go. But if you look like around Gordon, there's not a charging station for 75 or 80 miles, right? And I was talking to one gentleman who runs a trucking company, and he wanted to bring out one of his electric heavy trucks from Los Angeles to Nebraska. And his team said, well, we can tow it out here. There's no way to drive it out here. So when you're talking about getting outside of urban areas, electric vehicles don't really work. So we have to have other solutions. If you want to reduce the impact on the environment, which we all do, let's come up with other solutions. And that's why, for example, I introduced my Flex Fuel Fairness Act with Senator Klobuchar. Let's let flex fuel vehicles actually can get there. Like we saw a flex fuel vehicle as a Ford that had been converted to burn E85. It was getting 38 miles a gallon. Well, now you're talking about a solution that's going to reduce the impact on the environment, that's going to reduce your impact at the pump. Last time I filled up, I think the same octane gasoline with 10% ethanol was like 60 cents a gallon cheaper. So save money at the pump. And of course, biofuels help out our farmers and ranchers. So those are the kind of solutions that would work well in Nebraska versus the East Coast where you got all these urban areas that are all connected. There's all sorts of charging stations, but you got a mindset in Washington, D.C. that only sees that. And they don't see what happens in rural Nebraska.
Well, and you talk a little bit about that DC mindset. Obviously, this is an urbanizing country. A lot more people are moving to cities and suburbs. There still needs to be a farm bill. What do you think Nebraskans need in that farm bill, and how do you sell it to senators and others who maybe don't see the value of some of those policies?
Well, the first thing we got to do is remember that food security is national security. If your nation cannot feed itself, you are in a whole lot of hurt. So I think that's when I'm talking to my more urban senators, that's one of the things that I always remind them, hey, we need to make sure we can feed ourselves. And that's why you want a strong farm bill. And for Nebraskans, it's really pretty simple. It's what we've always wanted in a farm bill, which is make sure we got a good crop insurance program. Make sure that our environmental programs, which like CRP, we have the people are fans of, but don't put too many strings attached on things that are going to be, political correctness, agenda-driven stuff that actually don't really work for our farmers and ranchers. And the third thing is, like here in Nebraska, 30% of what we grow goes overseas. So let's have strong trade programs. Those aren't particularly controversial, and they're not new. We just need to make sure that every 5 years when we do a farm bill, we get those things in there so that it protects our farmers and ranchers.
Who is Pete Ricketts away from all of this? When you're not in front of a microphone, when you're not in your suit at serving as a senator or serving food at the People's City Mission like you did over lunch today, who are you?
I'm a father. I'm a husband. I spend time with my kids, my wife, my family. That's really, frankly, the next best is really the highest priority in my life, though the Senate job takes up more time of it. But that's where I focus the time is, what can I do spending time with my family?
And this question comes to you from Susan Littlefield in Northeast Nebraska. I'm giving her a little bit of a shout out right now because she said the one question she asked you that she really wanted to hear on this podcast was, what do you read?
What do I read? I am a history buff. So I love reading books on history. So you give me something on a history topic, and again, about how it impacts people's lives or what they're doing, along those lines. That's the stuff, especially actually some of the books, there's a author who came from one of my governor's lectures, Candace Millard. And so she's written a number of books, and she's a fantastic writer. She lives in Kansas City, but she's done one on Theodore Roosevelt. She's done one on Winston Churchill. She's done one on Garfield. So like those are the kinds of things that are really interesting. And then I just got done reading one about a book about the Revolutionary War, kind of the early battles around Saratoga. And again, the fascinating part was, in this author about the Revolutionary War one, was the politics involved of Washington versus, the Congress versus the generals they were sending up to do, like Benedict Arnold, who Washington actually sent up there to kind of help out, make sure that campaign was run properly. But all that sort of stuff, there was like politics just as much back in the Revolutionary War than there is today. So if you feel like, things are so political now, it's like, they've always kind of been that way.
That's absolutely true. Well, I always end with this question, but what did I not know enough to ask you about that you wanted to be sure to share today? Just
what a privilege it is to serve Nebraskans. I love our state. We live in the best place in the world. We should never take that for granted, especially now that I've been spending so much time in D.C. We really need to appreciate Nebraska. We've got such a great quality of life. We have great people, and the people are different. Like, I know that's an intangible kind of thing I'm sure everybody says about where they're from, but it's actually true for Nebraska. I hear it all the time about how we cooperate. You've heard Nebraska nice, so that's part of it. But I saw it as governor. I mean, you look at like things like Project Harmony in Omaha, where you've got a great collaboration between nonprofits, state government, county government, the police department. We have people come in from all over the country to look at that and say, how did you get that done here? You look at our legislature. And I know that was a tough session.
Yeah.
But guess what? We passed a budget. And they were on the floor together. And they debated. they change people's minds, right? That doesn't happen on the floor of the Senate. We're not there doing that. We don't pass budgets either, by the way, right? We don't pass our appropriations bill. So
not yet.
Yeah, we're going to get on that. But I mean, the point is, there's so many things that we have that we take for granted. And then you go someplace in Washington, D.C., and you're like, man, I am so glad I live in Nebraska.
Thanks, Governor. I'm sorry. Thanks, Senator. Wow, I knew I was going to do that today. Thank you, Senator, for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Aaron.
That'll wrap us up for Picking Corn with Pete Ricketts.